of the Academy, Dr. Simon Mary Sese Ayokai. And I'd like to call up my colleague, Dr. John Segun Odeyemi. Odeyemi. Yeah, the pronunciation is correct. We work in the Institute together. The administration established a special project involving the 6 African-American saints to be. And so Dr. Odeyemi works with us in the Institute in that capacity, and he also teaches in the theology department as well. So I'm introducing him, and he's doing a major introduction. Thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Introduction. Dr. Simon Mary Sese Ayokai was born in Nigeria. He received his undergraduate education in philosophy at the Spiritan School of Philosophy in Nigeria in 1997. He began his graduate studies in theology and religion at the Spiritan International School of Theology and University of Nigeria from 1998 to 2000. Before migrating to the United States to continue at St. John's Seminary, Amarillo, California, where he earned a graduate degree in theology with a focus in medical ethics in 2007. He obtained his PhD in systematic theology from Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, 2013. Dr. Ayokai currently is an associate professor of systematic theology at the University of Portland. He is the coordinator of the university's Theology Thursday Lecture Series. He is a recipient of the University of Portland's Outstanding Scholar Award for 2021. He is a fellow at the Western Institute. He is also a fellow of the France Center for Leadership. He is a member of the editorial board of the journal Springer Nature Essay for Social Sciences. Dr. Ayokai is chairing also a member of the several international research projects on relevant pedagogies for colleges, theologies of recognition for marginalized communities in the world, and queer communities in Africa. Dr. Simon has worked extensively with communities at the margins in Nigeria and in the United States of America. He has held academic positions at Loyola Marymount University, Valparaiso University, and St. Louis University. As a product of multiple contexts, he is an international, he works at the intentional and creating spaces for multiple perspectives in his research and teaching. His research focuses on religion, race, and identity constructions, African approaches to ethics, African philosophies, cultures, and theologies, religion and violence, comparative theology, themes in systematic theology, and interfaith studies. Among his published works include a monograph titled Fostering Interreligious Encounters in Pluralist Societies, Hospitality and Friendship, published by Palgrave Macmillan, 2019. 2 edited anthologies, one of which is Religion, Women of Color, and the Suffrage Movement, The Journey to Holistic Freedom, published by Lexington Books, 2022. To his credit, he has 14 book chapters and 36 peer-reviewed articles in reputable journals, 52 entries in nationally and internationally recognized journals and blogs. He has given over 80 scholarly papers, keynote addresses, and several topics ranging from social imaginations, colonial approaches to identity constructions, sociological approaches to understanding interfaith encounters, and the construction of structures of marginalization, and many more. Simon Mary works have been published by Routledge, Palgrave Macmillan, Pauline Press, Nigeria in Africa, Oxford University Press, Cambridge Scholars Press, and several peer-reviewed national and international journals. One of his forthcoming books explores a decolonial critique of Christology and visions of the human, Palgrave Macmillan Press. Another forthcoming work offers a decolonial critique of ecclesial imaginations in the continent of Africa with a special focus on the Catholic Church in Nigeria, to be published by Brill Press. Simon Mary, my very good friend and conversation partner, is presented this evening, God is Black, a theological summons for embracing wokeness as a way of being in the world. I'd like to introduce and bring him to the podium, Simon Mary.
I would like to say I am very grateful to be here. My first time at the Institute. It's so life-giving. When you are at the center of what you do, you might think that what you do is so little. This is a giant. This institute is a giant. So much possibilities, so much opportunities, so much creativity playing itself out here. I can write books and books and tell stories, endless stories about what I have experienced here so far. It's so life-giving. Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to share this annual lecture with you. Before I begin, you'll be hearing me use terms that might be a little bit disturbing, so let me clarify, because language there is where all emotions are produced, whether positive or negative. You hear me when I say whiteness as a mode of being. I'm not referring to white skin or the white, anyone who identifies as a white person, but rather I'm referring to the worldview that has been constructed, but which was particularly constructed by Europeans when they ventured outside of the European continent into other continents. So black bodies or black skins can embody whiteness in their imagination and ways of being in the world. And black, when I talk about black, I'm also talking about the worldview, an anthropological vision that is ascribed to a particular type of people. It could even be the poor white person. So on that note, let me begin. So no identity is devoid of both the political and the religious ritualistic process of validating it in the world where such identity is lived out. Even when such an identity is itself intended to dehumanize, it is always ritualized to allow for its legitimization by the systems that produce it. In her work, Ritual Identity, Susan van der makes a case for an individualistic ritualization of identity that plays out amongst pilgrims to Spain's Santiago de Compostela. She makes the claim that, and I quote, the ritual self, as an idealized identity, functions thus as a critique of one's regular cultural identity, unquote. Without denying Van der Berg's reclaiming of the individual within the matrix of the collective as a means of decolonizing the dominant collective identity, my focus for now is an attempt to speak to blackness and its ritualized framework as a way of addressing the foundational question: how does blackness embody and evoke a theosis of rebellion in the face of structures of marginalities and oppression operating in the world? I'm intentional at moving away from discourses of the individual as against the collective for the following reason. Notions of Western individualism or individual rights originate from the very matrix of erasure of otherness that is rooted in visions of scarcity. The individual is seen always in opposition to the communal and vice versa. When scarcity is the operating rule in such a conceptualization of rights, then rights themselves become products of competition and struggle. Who must embody such rights, and at whose expense become the operating logic in such a world? Rather than turn to individual rights, I am more interested in the discourse on the production of the world and beings shaped and sustained by white imagination, for humans defined by the contours of blackness. By contours, I'm referring to the worldview, colonial and racial historicities into which such bodies defined as black are thrown into. I am also interested in how such a worldview and its racial historicities are upended by the sacramentality of rebellion that blackness opens up through the correct concreteness of the embodied realities defining blackness. Stated simply, I am particularly interested in how black wokeness is an expression of divinization, which is theosis in Greek. Now, unpacking the historicities of the hermeneutic of blackness, I'm always interested in meaning, how people construct meaning, and the politics of meaning. So let me begin with a question that cannot be ignored if one is to adequately retrieve a hermeneutic on blackness as a term to wokeness, which is itself a theosis of solidarity with God among us. Does blackness embody pathologies, or is it a graced way of being in the world? Frantz Fanon offers a jarring response to the question in the opening chapter of Black Stain, White Mask by locating the discourse within the domain of phenomenology, of language, that attempts to engage phenomenology of perception that the word black evokes in the collective historicities that whiteness has produced in the world. He argues, and I quote, "The black person possesses two dimensions, one with his fellow blacks, the other with the whites. A black person behaves differently with a white person than they do with another black person. There is no doubt whatsoever that this vociferousness is a direct consequence of the colonial undertaking. Nobody dreams of challenging the fact that its principal inspiration is nurtured by the core of theories which represent the black person as the missing link in the slow evolution from ape to humanity. There are objective facts that state reality." Fanon seeks to situate his human of color in a conflict-ridden relationship with others. This human of color exists to the extent that is seen and heard by others, to the extent that they are for others. A common motif that runs through the works of Fanon is that of the black experience that encodes a ritualization of blackness, whether in the world of colonialism or of structural racism. For Fanon, blackness cannot be spoken of via ontology because its very construction is itself devoid of lived experience. Blackness is a construction of the white gaze. Consequently, and I quote, "The black person has no ontological resistance in the eyes of the white person," he argues. In other words, blackness embodies a split, an erasure, and a manufactured visibility, always because it is a production of a gaze intended to conceal and to reveal not in the trueness of the subject who embodies it, rather it is always in the gaze of the one who produces the objectivized creature. Fanon captures this pathological dialectic in the following words, and I quote him again. "So they were countering my irrationality with rationality. My rationality with the true rationality. I couldn't hope to win. I tested my hereditary. I did a complete checkup of my sickness. I wanted to be typically black. That was out of the question. I wanted to be white. That was a joke. And when I tried to claim my negritude intellectually as a concept, they snatched it away from me. They proved to me that my reasoning was nothing but a phase in the dialectic," unquote. To be seen from the locus of freedom is to be recognized as a valued being. However, the gaze that Fanon calls attention to in the pathological dialectic that blackness is meant to embody strips any valuation from the beings that have been labeled to embody blackness itself. Freda Ikoto sheds light on a conclusion made by Fanon, which cannot be ignored, in my opinion, even though it evokes its own controversies when she writes, "Blackness, as most blacks live and experience it, is actually a creation of and a reaction to whiteness, white history and culture, as well as white racial and colonial imaginaries," unquote. Now I'm forced to ask the question, is there an escape from this pathological dialectic that is rooted in blackness? This question will be given a response later. For now, let us continue to unpack blackness by being in close dialogue with Fanon. And I'm intentional with reading Fanon because Fanon was a psychiatrist and he was dealing with the mind. Yeah. So you know where I'm going with this. So Fanon uses the motif of white gaze to explain the production of blackness as a pathologized being shaped by sameness and unseenness. Such matrix of sameness and unseenness never allow for anthropological freedom on the part of the one who has been labeled black. Rather, one is seen or unseen for a purpose. It is to serve the interest of the white gaze. The white gaze that plays out in the colonial world is meant to produce violence as a mode of being for black bodies. In fact, it cannot but do so because the colonial world is a Manichaean world, argues Fanon. In such a world, the colonist is not content with physically limiting the space of the colonized, that is, with the help of his agents of law and order. As if to illustrate the totalitarian nature of colonial exploitation, the colonist turns the colonized into a kind of quintessence of evil. There is an intended flow of logic in such a visualization of colonized bodies that are themselves embodiments of evil. Then the colonizers are the virtuous ones because by being the enforcers of their own conceptualization of justice on the bodies and systems living in and operating in such a world, they are demonstrating the ritualization of the virtuous life. To be virtuous is to embody the ethos of colonialism towards black bodies, who, left alone, will continue to perpetuate evil as a mode of being. Furthermore, such a logic justifies colonialism and all that it evokes. It justifies a hierarchy of being human. After all, true humanity resides in being a colonizer. Linguistic altering of blackness evokes in white imagination the inherent pathologies coded into the vision of the human ascribed to black bodies. Consequently, to be black is to embody the content of the Manichaean world created by the colonizer. Fanon states this well when he writes, and I quote him again, sometimes this Manichaeanism reaches its logical conclusion and dehumanizes the colonized subject. In plain talk, he is reduced to the state of an animal. And consequently, when the colonist speaks of the colonized, he uses zoological terms. Allusion is made to the slithering movements of the yellow race, the odors from the native quarters to the hordes, the stink, the swarming, the seething, and the gesticulations, unquote. The pathologies inherent in blackness as conceived by the white gaze in the colonized world attains fruition and maturity only when colonized black bodies utter categorically that white culture and white values are legitimate and must reign supreme, unquote. Fanon argues in his work, The Wretched of the Earth, that it is only when this utterance is made by black bodies that the colonizer stops perpetuating the violence of indoctrination of white culture in the world constructed for black bodies. A critique of his view must be given. The fact that an enduring colonialism persists, which he sheds light on in his work Black Skin, White Marks, that holds captive the black imagination, in this case it is coloniality of imagination. And let me quickly explain what coloniality of imagination means. Coloniality of imagination operates by creating in the subject of an erasure of memories of the past that do not meet the logic of the new realities being expressed by the subject. After all, colonialism has legitimacy by always negating the histories, cultures, social systems, and economies of the people being colonized. The colonizer has a legitimacy in the places traditionally occupied by the colonized only by showing how the colonized is existentially dependent on the benevolence of the colonizer. I am a decolonial scholar. For some years, I've been studying the colonial movements, the three colonialities that decolonial scholars engage in: the coloniality of power, coloniality of knowledge, and the coloniality of being. And it dawned on me that there was a fourth coloniality no one was talking about, which perpetuates these other three colonialities. And when you remove the barrel of gum, how does pathologies perpetuate themselves in societies? Because I was studying Africa and asking the question, why is Africa still poor today? After independence, then I realized that it is the coloniality of imagination. So I introduced the fourth coloniality to the discourse. That if you engage coloniality of imagination, then you can create a new world. And that is why I became very serious scholar studying how the imagination operates. Because if you tell me how you think, I can tell you the world you have constructed. And how do I get that? I study the language you use. The words, how you arrange your words. And I'll tell you the world you are going to create. Language is where we are held captive. So that said, furthermore, colonialism of imagination is what Fanon alludes to when he argues that the colonizer only stops the violence of the epistemic assimilation that black psyches and bodies are forced to undergo through their violent exposure to white culture. Interestingly, Fanon pushes the argument further by stating the following: this epistemic assimilation that becomes the foundation of coloniality of imagination produces a pathological understanding of alterity in the black psyche. In other words, alterity produces visions of anthropological erasures in the black psyche and replaces it with the vision of whiteness as the embodiment of the true human. The split in the black psyche produces black self-hate and black on black violence. It also reveals the inherent suspicion of intercontinental hate between blacks in the global north and blacks in the global south, as many of us have come to experience in our lifetime. There can be no unity because the black psyche is split. It always creates division in its own, it's unable to create holistic community of alignment or of purpose. So without the needed work of decolonizing black psyches, such erasures will hold black psyches captive. Achille Mbembe offers a credible insight in showing how this pathology of erasure has also defined the so-called attempt at responding to colonialism in what he calls the camp form mentality, or a swing to extreme politics. The camp form, in its modern expression, embodies the usage of state power to systematically expose women, children, and the aged to hunger, torture, forced labor, and epidemics. In fact, the nation state as produced by the colonial machines that play out in colonized regions of the world is itself a machinery intended to produce and legitimize expressions of this camp form or extreme politics that perpetuate the pathologies of erasure and violence towards colonized bodies and psyches. It is a mass production of self-hate and self-erasures. Mbembe captures this succinctly when he writes about how colonial racism plays out in the world produced by the colonizer for the colonized. And I quote him: "Racism was simultaneously the driver of this sort of society and its principle of destruction. And insofar as a self-scarcity existed without an order, the order being only another odd one mean, including in the figure of denial, killing the other was no longer separable from killing oneself. The nature of racism is always to try to avoid sclerosis. To maintain its virulence and its efficacy, each time it has to renew itself to change its physiognomy to metamorphose," unquote. Expounding more on the role of racism in shaping, sustaining, and validating the pathologies of erasure, Mbembe sheds light on Fanon's insight. According to Mbembe, the colonial state produces a subject that is always narcissistic. There is no alterity to be encountered in such a state by the subject. If you read the work by Anikwe Ama, which came out in 1958, titled "The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born," he was reflecting on Ghana. The Gold Coast is free, Ghana is free. Nkrumah has come in, who has written about conscientism and upholding negritude, but yet the pathologies of colonialism continue to perpetuate themselves there in Ghana. Ghana was free, but the psyche of Ghana was never free. So furthering the discourse on the pathology of erasure that is produced by colonialism for the colonized black bodies, one has to engage briefly insights from the Kenyan scholar Ngugi wa Thiong'o. The creation of a split in the colonized psyche takes shape in the usage of language, especially the language of the colonizer by the colonized. In wa Thiong'o's words, and I quote him, "Colonial alienation takes two interlinked forms, an active or passive distancing of oneself from the reality around, and an active or passive identification with that which is most external to one's environment. It starts with a deliberate disassociation of the language of conceptualization, of thinking, of formal education, of mental development, from the language of daily interactions in the home and in the community. It is like separating the mind from the body so that they are occupying two unrelated linguistic spheres in the same person. On a larger social scale, it is like producing a society of bodiless heads and headless bodies," unquote. Now, a philosopher I enjoy so much, Hannah Arendt, who has written a lot on totalitarianism, studying how societies embrace violence as a way of being. She was interviewed after the Second World War. She was a Jewish, German Jew who fled to France, not Vichy France, during the Second World War. And then after she came back to Germany, they interviewed her. They said, "Why do you still speak German?" She said, "I was born German. When I fled," she writes in French, she's a polyglot, "I refused to speak French. Because if I speak French, Nazism has won, because it has split me in two. I chose not to speak French while I was in exile. But when I came back to the country that chased me out, there was something I owned which the Nazis could not own, take away from me. It was the language. When I spoke German, I became Jewish again." But in our context, when blacks around the world speak, there is a split. Because the language we speak divides us, dehumanizes. It is not meant to make you holistic. The way you think produces a humanity. And when you cannot think in a way that roots you in your ancestral heritage, you will always be a being that lacks. That said, I continue. Earlier on, I posed the following question: is there an escape from this pathological dialectic that is rooted in blackness? In response to the question, I want to engage James H. Cone closely and show how he rescues the vision of blackness from the idolatry of the white gaze and locates it in the icon of freedom that is expressed through wokeness. Here, I am intentional in stating that freedom, as articulated by Cone, must not be conceived through the hermeneutic on individualism found in Western modernity. In fact, for Cone, there is no freedom in that vision of modernity. What exists there is the idolatry of narcissism. Now, blackness, an icon of saturated freedom. Idols have fixed, preconceived contents of biases. They mediate the intended meaning by the meaning maker who produces the idol. In the context of Africa and the Americas, where persons of African descent now call their home, the production of blackness as an idol of control produces always a lack and inability to embody the fullness of humanity. Consequently, blackness as constructed in the white gaze or the colonist imagination is radically defined by scarcity. Scarcity of full humanity, scarcity of historicities, scarcity of ethical consciousness, scarcity of epistemic abilities, scarcity of memory, scarcity of spirituality, and religious orientation that makes the embodied human a being defined by pity or at best a mistake of nature. With this preconceived notion of blackness, any meeting, not encounter, of black bodies by white bodies is a gift that whiteness gives to black bodies. I can just ask you to do a simple exercise right now. If I ask each of you, tell me your maternal lineage from your mother's line, you're going to be stuck. If I tell you, tell me your paternal lineage on your father's side, you are going to tell me more, give me more information. It's not accidental. The world you live in, the language you speak, is a world which the language validates patriarchy. And so your maternal memory has been erased from your psyche, unless you do the needed work. That said, I continue. So Cone chooses to respond to this preconceived content of bias that the idolatry of white gaze has used to define black bodies by locating the discourse within the domain of giftedness. What type of giftedness are we talking about here? It is that of rebellion, which is a way of being woke. Cone turns to Albert Camus as a major interlocutor to retrieve the inherent iconic nature of blackness as a saturated anthropology of freedom. Icons or symbols are themselves saturated with meaning, and they serve as mediators for encounter between the subject and the other whom the icon helps to mediate. With an icon or a symbol, there's always something new. This is because of a saturated mediating role for meaning making by the one who encounters it. Icons are always mediating encounters. And so in Camus' thought, rebellion serves as a ritual of freedom. Camus argues that the true rebel is not the person who conforms to the orthodoxy of some revolutionary ideology, but rather is a person who could say no to injustice. To say no in the face of injustice is itself a ritual in freedom. It entails an orientation away from scarcity into the domain of surplus. It is itself a rejection of the preconceptualization of biases that are rooted in the idol that white race produces in the bodies labeled as black. This rejection allows one to be oriented towards an apophatic awareness, a turn to wokeness that unfolds in freedom and rejection of subjugation. And what is apophaticism? Right? Apophaticism is the locus from which God invites all to encounter God, us, and the world. Apophaticism is where icons derive their saturated meanings. It is how God uses creation to become a media of surplus meanings for encounters. It is where the fullness of life is experienced. Though Camus was not thinking theologically when he wrote his work, The Rebel, rebellion as a ritual of social justice in the face of structural, psychological, historical, and anthropological injustice is itself an ethical turn to freedom. At the heart of such a freedom is the emergence of the rich imagination of the human person as a being with surplus of dignities worthy of encounter. And I will say this quickly. Apophaticism is why God can never be conceptualized in any totality. So when you say God is good, apophaticism negates it. Because your understanding and my understanding of goodness is always finite, it's limited. To know God is to control God, and none of us can control God.
Amen.
And that's why I find it so amusing and silly that religious people begin to kill each other in the name of God. God is beyond that. All revelations is but a footnote of who God is.
Amen. Amen.
So to be woke is to say no is an existential statement. No is an orthopraxis ritual that is rooted in the experiential. By this I mean that the one who chooses to give an ethical negation to structures of evil does that because they have been in proximity to the effects of such structures on the human body or psyche. It is not a response held in the domain of semantics. Rather, it is existential all the way. This is exactly what Cone has in mind when he writes, and I quote him, "To experience the sufferings of little children is to reject the universal human being in favor of particular human beings. It forces you to say something that takes seriously the meaning of human suffering," unquote. Cone goes further to articulate and link rebellion to the vision of the human as ordained by God. All theology that is what they sought must necessarily find its home in the domain of freedom. Consequently, to speak of the human being is to orient one's speech and imagination to the domain of freedom. In the face of evil, wokeness is itself a ritual of freedom, especially when such positionality is oriented towards the liberation of all and the eradication of systems of marginality and erasures. Hence, Cole argues that inherent in freedom is the recognition that there is something wrong with society, and those who are free will not be content until all members of society are treated as persons. There comes a time in life when persons realize that the world is not as they dreamt, and they have to make a choice: submit or risk all. Being free means that the only real choice is risking all, unquote. Racism and colonialism have their own innate logics. They operate with the false assumption that there is a scarce human nature, and all beings do not possess it equally. Consequently, this allows for the articulation of a hierarchy of beings, which is itself a coloniality of being. Coloniality of being is the coding into structures of societies the vision of the human that presents some humans to be more human than others. In this case, it is coded into the language of racial superiority, civilizations, and wealth itself. When one buys into this logic, then the next move in such a logic is itself the erection of another false ideal, the hierarchy of access to knowledge. This is itself a coloniality of knowledge. Yet the persons with full humanity must necessarily have the ability to produce and sustain true knowledge. Their knowledge production becomes the meter upon which all other sources of knowledge must be judged, validated, or outrightly negated. None of this is possible without the use of power that itself produces its own coloniality, a coloniality of power. Power as a tool of oppression is produced through many tricks in such a logical way of thinking and being. The barrel of the gun, the hijacking of economic systems and factors of production, the use of religion and culture to erase those who must be stripped of their claim to humanity, and the restriction to access to the land itself as a source of sustenance are all ways that coloniality of power is used to sustain a particular vision of the human that racism and colonialism uphold as their standard bearers. Cole argues that through the experience of the different colonialities operating in the world created by racism and colonialism, it is not difficult for the oppressed to understand the meaning of freedom. They are forced by the very nature of their condition to interpret their existence in the world contrary to the value structures of an oppressive society. For the oppressed, to be is to be in revolt against the forces that impede the creation of the new person. Thus, the response of no in the face of injustice is a deliberate rejection of the different colonialities operating in the world constructed by racism and colonialism. In fact, it is itself the gift of escape from the addictive power of coloniality of imagination that intends to replicate the pathologies of inhumanity that racism and colonialism produces in the psyche of its intended victims. Blackness is both a gift and an escape from the hegemony of white gaze, and is hermeneutic of scarcity that it projects on bodies it has defined as black. Cole argues that it is the biblical concept of the image of God that makes black rebellion in America human. When black persons affirm their freedom in God, they must say no to white racists. By saying no, they say yes to God and their blackness.
Amen.
Affirming at the same time the inhumanity of the white neighbor who insists on playing God, unquote. In other words, by saying no to all that racism and colonialism projects on bodies that are called black, there is a twofold movement that occurs. First is a form of epistemic conversion that allows for the upending of the encoded biases rooted in the world that racism and colonialism intend to uphold and validate always. This epistemic conversion only occurs because there is an epistemic crisis that is brought about by the rebellion embodied in the response of no to racism and colonialism. In fact, epistemic crisis is a form of kenotic conversion. It is kenotic because it empties one of one's epistemic baggage. This emptying is necessary for one to truly be open to receive that which is new into one's life. The response of no is the pathway to a new way of being human. One that allows for the emptying of the word blackness in a manner that its idolatrous content of diminishment and scarcity is abandoned in order to reclaim its iconic possibilities for mediating surplus humanity, surplus imagination, surplus historicities, surplus memories, surplus encounters, and surplus hospitality towards all. This is exactly what black wokeness does. To be woke is to be rebellious, and to say no more tolerance of erasures playing out in a racialized society. Second, the response of no to the structures of marginality inherent in the worlds that racism and colonialism produce allows for a turn to the apophatic God. While the cataphatic God mediates what we know of God, the apophatic God invites us into the domain of the unknown, where surprise and wonder become the modus vivendi for all who inhabit such a space of encounter. Where I'm going with this is that black psyches must also experience a crisis so that it can wake up and embrace wokeness and say no more to my dehumanization and no more of me becoming an idol that dehumanizes other people, be they black bodies or white bodies, so that we now embrace a new humanity, a humanity for all. So it's not just one group I'm talking to, it's a two-edged sword that I'm swinging here. So surprise and wonder that are the markers of the apophatic God allow for the claiming of the image of God that is rooted in wokeness as rebellion. Wokeness is God's image of humanity, where humanity is involved in the liberation struggle against the forces of inhumanity. The motifs of surprise and wonder are themselves pneumatological. They allow for an orientation towards the Spirit, who renews all things and makes the impossible possible, and the illogical logical. Where wokeness is seen as problematic and illogical in the face of the systems it opposes, as we see today in the United States, the pneumatological focus of wokeness allows for a new vision of the human to arise, one that transcends all that racism and colonialism have rendered subhuman. This new humanity is a humanity that is in solidarity with God. It is a humanity that is divinized. Consequently, one can argue that the statement God is black is a revelation and constituent marker of this new humanity. To be a black God allows for the divinization of wokeness as rebellion. In fact, wokeness as rebellion is the ritual of encounter with the black God. To rebel against racism and colonialism is to take seriously the summons of God, who insists on encountering humanity outside of the logic created by systems of marginality. Now my conclusion, I know you must be tired. Returning to Fanon's insights, one can conclude that hope is at the center of his critique of colonialism and the pathologies it produces both in the colonizer and the colonized. Looking at the responses of Africans to colonialism, in his words, and I quote him, "The African peoples, in a painful and heroic effort, are standing upright and have decided at all costs to take back their stolen personality, to affirm their humiliated dignity, to wrest back their status as free peoples, to turn forever the hideous stage of slavery and servitude," unquote. The motif of hope that Fanon locates in his vision of a free Africa evokes a deliberate turn to strategic alliances that the colonized must embrace if they are to undo the structures of marginality playing out in their contexts and lives. Hence, Fanon argues that colonialism is itself an international reality that favors foreign and domestic actors. Consequently, a response to it must also be international and embody strategic alliances that go beyond the context of the colonized. It involves finding those social justice collectives, institutions, and persons who embody the common good and are willing to rebel against the unjust system wherever they may be found. It involves an embrace of and a turn to rebellion as divine human response to global and contextual injustices. Theologically, hope is the virtue that links the linearity of our chronos existence with the presence of God's kairos time of encounter. By reclaiming our memories through the rituals of remembering, hope allows us to become aware of the enduring tapestry of beauty that defines our lives over time, which is the past. This tapestry makes us become more aware of what is happening to us in the nowness of our existence. In this way, we become anchored in the presence of God, which is a presence of divine invitation to each of us to not give up, which is the present. This anchoring that God initiates in our lives allows us to imagine a future that is not abstract or rooted in fantasy. It is a future of continuum, one that makes the tapestry of God's beauty that runs through our past existence into our present realities, and they're leading us like a lamp in the dark into a brighter dawn of the future. So hope holds these three times together and makes it the nowness of God's time, which is a kairos time. These tri movements can find their authentic realization in the ritual praxis of rebellion, an embrace of wonder and surprise that blackness evokes in the converted imagination is only possible when one embraces a life that is grounded in enduring hope. Without hope, one cannot rebel against systems of marginality. And without rebellion, one cannot reimagine a better world that transcends the current oppressive structures at play in the world or one's context. Simply stated, hope is what makes everything to make sense. But remember this, hope is itself a praxis, it's not a feeling. It's not a feeling only, it's beyond that. It's not just a feeling or an idea. It is a way of living and being in the world. It involves an orientation and a positionality that preferences surplus imagination and generosity over the idolatry of scarcity. It involves saying yes to resilient ways of being in the face of the violence of erasure. It involves the positionality of justice for all as against the idolatry of narcissistic orientation of greed. It involves radical forgiveness while calling out and calling in those who perpetuate evil as against those who only want to be vengeful. And Dr. Vanessa White, sorry for putting you on the spot, knows this more than I do. The spirituals are all about hope. You cannot understand black identity and the spirituals unless you locate it in hope. So, hope is the platform on which one stands and lives one's life in such a manner that one can thus see the new horizon of life and acceptance that God invites all to be part of. For Fanon and Combe, blackness is an embodiment of saturated hope. It is about being woke all the way. On that note, I say to us all, let us keep being woke. Thank you.
Amen. Oh my God, that was good. Excellent. Excellent.
Wow.
Wow, right. Oh my God.
Wow. Wake you up on a Sunday afternoon.
Amen.
Questions? Comments?
Or reaction or opposition, I don't mind. Introduce yourself first.
Yes.
Hi everyone, my name is Efani. I was a student at Xavier, and then I taught at Xavier some years ago. Thank you so much for the lecture. It was just beautiful. There's no, I'm short of words. I was really moved. So when I came to listen to the lecture, your title, Wokeness, captivated me because I wanted to know which type of wokeness. The contemporary colloquial wokeness or the wokeness which you define. And I guess the contemporary wokeness that I see, which imposes language on people, right, which we are seeing currently about using pronouns and so many other types of wokeness, seems different than the wokeness I heard you speak of, which is a resistance to dehumanization. So I was so glad to capture that actually in the talk.
Don't be too fast.
Oh, yeah. Maybe you might have a different take, yeah. But is there similarity? And then the second question, the second concept that took hold of me was...
Can I address that first question?
Oh, certainly.
Before I forget. Now, Michael Iafrate, he's dead now, may he rest in peace. He wrote his paper, he was working on his dissertation. I was looking at 9/11 and looking at dangerous memory, using Jean-Baptiste Met's conceptualization of dangerous memories and how they play out in rituals in the liturgy. How do communities ritualize a way of being that is beyond the oppressive structures? As a Catholic and being a Catholic theologian, he taps into the liturgy. We enter into dangerous memories through an amnetic encounter with Christ, which is brought about by the Spirit. That which happened, we in linear time say happened 2,000 years ago, is happening in the nowness of God's time, the Kairos time. And that's how we tap into it. But it's not just remembering, it's a remembering so that we can have a new vision of moving beyond the traumas of the present and be healed. Now, but he called something out, the idolatry of dangerous memory. There is always the shadow of the virtue. Every virtue has a shadow, the vice. And he was looking at American expansionism. And every 9/11 we say we remember. We don't remember doing a dangerous memory. It's an idolatrous remembering as a way of perpetuating empire dynamics and conquest of other people. So he called attention to that. We have to be very careful, and I think that's what you are doing with me. So now that said, you made a comment of mention of pronouns and all that stuff. The question I always ask, why are some people saying, I cannot be identified with he, she pronoun? It opens up a pathway for us to ask the question. Our anthropological vision, is it certain or is it unfolding? So rather than say, oh, this is how you are, for you, you wake up every morning, you know who you are, you look at the mirror and define me, and he, him, or whatever, you're happy. But there are some people who wake up, they see a crisis, they experience a crisis. Now we must not say they are crazy or whatever. The question we should ask, in fact I wrote something on this 2 months ago, responding to the Archbishop of Portland, National Catholic Reporter, on gender theory and his position, and I said, no, pay close attention again to the vision, to the tradition. These issues are opening up new conversations for us in the church. And we must ask ourselves, what is the Spirit telling us through these issues, conversations? And it's reading the signs of the times. The tradition is not stale. The tradition is a living tradition. And as a living tradition, it must be pruned. It must be pruned. And so, the language we use 500 years ago might become traumatic today. What is the language of today? And that's what theologians need to do. So I said to Bishop, we are here for you. So that said, I wanted to tell you that wokeness can have many things. Like I told you before, I began my conversation saying, these are the pathologies of blackness. But there is also the pathway of escape from those pathologies without abandoning blackness. We can now say, okay, we are all black. Not just those with the black skin color. All of us are black. Look at the room. We have white people, we have black people, we have different colors, shades, rainbow here. But we're all in the Institute for Black Catholic Studies. We're not in the Institute for White Catholic Studies, but we all embrace blackness as a way of being, because it is a sacramentalized way of redemption and being in the world that God imagines. That's where I'm going with wokeness. But while being aware that there is the demonic shadow side of it, and I'm not interested in that. Yeah, the next question.
Yeah, the last question, I hope it doesn't take a long time. But the concepts that you elucidated on the colonization of imagination, I wanted to know, do you have a vision of what that looks like?
Oh, big time.
Okay.
You want it? I'll tell you a story, and the story will give you the answer. In 2005, I was working in a parish. It's written in one of my works, though you can find it here. I was working in a parish in Houghton, California. And prior to this time, I had taught catechism, preparing people for the faith for 19 years. And prior to this time, I was a monk, Augustinian monk. I was also a missionary professed member of the Congregation of the Holy Spirit. And I was also in the Diocesan Seminary in Nigeria, then was now in the theologate in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. And then it was Thanksgiving preparation. We're going to have Mass. And then the priest said, "Yes, Simon, I didn't want you to be alone." So I put the image of the black Jesus on the altar. And me with my big mouth, and the microphone there, I didn't know it was on. I looked up. That's not Jesus. Jesus is not black. The entire church stopped singing and turned around and came from the black guy. But now what did that tell you? It meant that I was never Christianized. I was colonized. That is what I'm talking about, colonialism of imagination. What is your imagination of God? If I ask all of you now to draw God, you are going to draw something that is not you. But God became one with creation. So all our imagination and constellation of God must also include us, or else it is an idol of empire. Make sense? Good. Any other question? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
How can we help our families and communities decolonize their lives?
By being, by being a troublemaker, good trouble.
What was the question?
No, but really, yeah, but really, let me explain this. You know when you are driving on the freeway, you know why after a while the road has to curve. You know why? Because if you keep driving on a very straight road, people will fall asleep and they will be having accidents and die. That's the reason why the road curves. And so, as a theologian, your job is not to be the police officer of doctrine. I keep saying this. Others did that work. Aquinas lived 800 years ago and gave us excellent theology, but that his theology was speaking to the realities of his time. We can appropriate certain things from what he taught. But if your theology, and I'm speaking to the theologians here because this is an institute of theologians. So if your theology does not even add a footnote for us to imagine and broaden the borders of our thinking of how to be God's creatures in our times, then your theology is sick and redundant. Then you become a police officer of a stale system. Yes, I am very strong about that opinion. I'm known for that. Again, all theologies are supposed to push the imagination forward. It's supposed to make us uncomfortable. Because our God is not a God of make me feel good. Our God is the God of making us uncomfortable so that we get our butts up and go and do the needed work. Yeah, go ahead.
Well,
the imagination of hope, I will tie that into the imagination of hope. Hope is about surprise. Like I came, I was coming here, I was like, New Orleans, I've never been to New Orleans. Never been to the Institute. What am I coming to? Let me even remove myself from that picture. I'll use the biblical guy. The brothers, is it Nathaniel or what I was talking to his brother? And he was telling him, oh, you met this guy called Jesus. And he said, Jesus. From where? Nazareth. Can anything good come out from Nazareth? Middle of nowhere. Not on the GPS. Nobody did this. It's not Rome. Nazareth. surprises you. It shatters your conceptualization of reality. It is the speed bump that God throws at you. But it is also the lifeline that pulls you into the new horizon. That is how you decenter the imagination. And because decentering the imagination means that once you are shattered, you still believe that there is a world better than the one you see. And that was what MLK said, that one day a white boy and a black boy and a white girl will hold hands and walk side by side. That was at the heart of the resistance of whiteness against the civil rights movement. Yet he was saying this. He was seeing the mountaintop. The landscape of hope.
And the Institute for Black Catholic Studies is an institute of hope.
Yes. Yes. It is not an... Thank you for that. Clap for that. Please. It is not an institute of, oh, let us study what those people did in the past. No. It's not an institute of, let us go and hate white people. No. It's an institute where we come to study, to create and imagine a new world for all. Yes, it's 3 weeks you come every day, you have classes every day, but it's a 3 weeks of encounter, not of just trying to know. And the encounter decenters the self, so that you can rebuild yourself.
And the encounter is the definition of sacrament.
Yes, all sacraments are encounters.
Yes.
Yeah. And I love this. Because if the sacraments don't decenter you, then I don't know what you are doing. The sacraments are supposed to decenter you, so that a new humanity can come out of you. That is why at the Mass, after you've done all those lovely rituals, what does the priest say? Ite missa est, you say, Deo gratias. It doesn't mean, thank God this is over, let me get my freedom. No! It simply means what you have become in this space, which was not what you were before. It is not yours to keep. It is yours to share. Amen. That was the same thing that Mary of Magdala experienced at the empty tomb. Yeah. She went in to see the Jesus, her friend, but that Jesus was gone. Yes. The Christ, the friend of all, was waiting. And now said, come, I still remember you. But you, no longer in the old language, but a new way of being. And that is the Easter message. Go and share this good news. Because what you have received, you are to give, not to hold on to. Thank you for that. Go ahead. Then I'll come there. Everyone will be addressed. Go ahead.
Yeah, you mentioned that we have to be open to what you call an anthropological vision. And the last time I checked, that word anthropos, the Greek word, that from our perspective, we look at male and female. That's where we are. And then we are looking at what you're calling anthropological vision that we have to be open to.
Of surplus. Not just of vision. Okay. Anthropological vision of surplus. Continue.
And so we all have to be open to this vision, that probably I call it anthropology from below. Is there anything like anthropology from above? Like what comes to my mind is like Jesus Christ, the perfect image of God, who became a perfect man. Is there anything like an anthropology from above? And what would that anthropology look like? That's one. And the second one is tied to it, what we call today. Now we hear that almost everything we have in the world today is like a social construct. And if that is the case, what is your position in absolute? Do you believe in absolute? Oh, and how does that tie to the anthropological vision?
I love this. You are speaking like a scripture scholar. Yes, I know that. To somebody from above or to somebody from below, you want to give me that is what you're okay? Let me respond. Thank you for the question. I love the question. God never brought about salvation from above. That's why Philippians chapter 2 verses 5 to 11 says that God came down, became human in everything except sin, emptied God's self of divinity, of power, divine power, and became the impotent God, so that God himself can be in solidarity with helpless humanity. So the very understanding of incarnation is itself in solidarity. And solidarity is not abstract. It is socially. It's saturated with sociality as it can be imagined. That said, yes, it is I will put it this way. It's very easy to talk about an anthropology from the abstract above because we don't have to deal with feelings, with the messiness of encounter. But the incarnation is at its heart, the messiness of God encountering creation. And when I mean that messiness, I'm talking about Nazareth and everything in that messiness of that no person's land. And so that is that aspect. But this binary you are creating is a false binary of above and below. Let's move beyond the binaries. Let us think beyond binaries. Binaries are visions of scarcity. They do not allow for the spectrum of vision to occur. Black, white, tall, short, man, woman. But we forget that our lives live in the pendulum swing between, not at the extremes. That said, you're talking about social construct or whatever. God is Trinitas, says Tertullian. It's community. The Father is not the Son is not the Spirit. Though I'm using that as metaphorical, so we can say God is mother or God is daughter. Because all metaphors are just footnotes, a statement. They don't exhaust their reality, or else they become idolatrous. If we insist on them being what that's the only way. So that's it. If God is community, then communitas becomes the pathway for us finding who we are and finding God. Never in the abstract. It is in that social realities. Even if those social realities do not manifest what we have been conditioned to be the holy. This is why Pope Francis is calling all of us to. That the church at its best is not at the center. It's always at the periphery. The church, the Spirit gave us identity at the periphery of empire. Why do we think that we can find fullness at the center? It doesn't work. And so you can't, like, if you ask me to look at this room now, I'm standing at the center. I have limited vision. How do I see you very well? I have to stand at the periphery. Then I see very well. Everyone. So we forget that. But the periphery is where everything is filled with surprise, messiness, illogicality. And that is why I say the God that we must follow is the God that is truly illogical. And power does not define that God, it's the powerless God. And so we must abandon power and embrace powerlessness. And what is powerlessness? It's a different type of community that it produces. I was just in Mexico last month at a conference where I helped to organize as well. We're meeting communities who exist at the peripheries of our society and church. Their language is different. Their ways of worshiping different. But I, as a theologian, I saw saturated grace emanating from these communities. Because I allowed myself, my imagination, to let go of the logic of the center. And allowed myself to be this radical, crazy, homeless person that they have been defined to be. Then I saw wisdom. And I encountered wisdom. So does that help? I know you asked a simple question, I gave you a multitude. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead and I'll come to you. To him and then, no, to her, yes, and then to him.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
I'm going to try to combine my comments all into one. Okay, and I do have a question.
Tell us who you are.
My name is TJ Nash, which I can tell you about myself by going into that comment. I'm a theology major from the school, from the theology department. I graduated less than 10 years ago. And through the 4 years that I was here, there was no language of communication with that theology department and what happens here in the summertime. In fact, there was more of an aversion to communicate, right? And so when you spoke about languages, that I thought about that. So that's part of my comment, is if there's anything you would say to that.
I have a lot to say about that.
Okay. In addition to that, you really already addressed it. But one of the things, being a theology major, I think about a lot is that desk-bound theology, which a theologian wrote about a few weeks ago. How does everything that you just did up there translate into the society? You kind of already addressed that as well. And the last comment that I had in my studies this week, I studied a lot about the hidden God, right? And so everything, this blackness that we speak of, the blackness that I have experienced is hidden to some. And I think there's a power in that. So even in the exposure of everything that you talked about, that hiddenness, I almost equate to the powerlessness that you speak of.
Good.
My question is simple.
No, hold on to that question.
All right.
Your comments need to be addressed.
All right.
You have made 3 important points. I want to begin with the last one. Hiddenness is apophaticism. And there's where saturated freedom plays itself out. Empire teaches you and I that the only way we can be in relationship is to control the narrative or the meeting or the order. So we name, we project labels, identities, or pathologies on each other. Blackness evokes pathologies. If you're a woman, you raise your voice in corporate America, oh, you're an angry black woman. Yes. That has ruined your career. No one is there to ask you, what was pinching you that made you to scream? They're like, why did you scream? Okay? And then you break your hair, oh, you are a thug. No one is asking you, how do you conceptualize beauty in your community? You've already been given an identity. So hiddenness is how God's beauty manifests itself. You cannot encounter that beauty unless you allow yourself to be crazy to enter into that space which has its own logic. Empire has a logic. The only way you can fight empire is not by using the empire's logic, because it controls that language. And once you use that as language and its logic, it will manifest an anthropological consciousness in you, which is subjectivity to it. It's an idol. So how do you go against it? You dance the dance of mad people. And then you can't fight it because it doesn't know what to do with you. And then you escape. That's what you're talking about. The second point, the first one you talked about, and I'll come to the second point you mentioned. The first one, it seems to be the case in many institutions. Departments of theology don't like institutes. They're like, oh, they don't do theology there. There's no serious academic work there. That's nonsense. It simply means that the person telling you that does not know how to do sophisticated theology. Because all theology comes from experience and encounter. Yeah. I am a systematic theologian by training, for your information. It's all about theory. I live in the world of theory. But I know that that theory is nonsense unless it is mediated through experience and encounters. I must go to the slums if I can do good theology.
Amen.
If I'm to do good theology.
Thank you.
All my theology comes from the street, for your information.
Yes, thank you.
I have been in the street. I encounter the street people. And then I ask myself, what theology is coming out from this experience?
That's right.
If you have never been off in the church, away from the church, you will not understand the pain of those who are leaving the church. Keep that in mind.
Lord have mercy.
Yeah. So your second point, what was your second point?
The second one has to do with desk theology.
Oh, yeah. In, what do you call it? In the 1800s, the British historians who sit in their libraries in Oxford and Cambridge never left there, and they are writing about the world, Africa, Asia, and other stuff. They call them armchair historians. Many theologians today are armchair theologians. Challenge them. How does your theology engage the world? Then they become mute. That's what this theology, some theology departments do, which is unfortunate. Yeah. Now your question, right?
All right, so the question, your name, Simon Mary.
Yeah.
Can you tell me what that is?
Oh my God, yes, I didn't need confession time. Simon is the only name I ever chose for myself. I was, in the culture I grew up and the nature by which I was born, I'm a triplet, so I was given names just by the way I was born and all that stuff. So when I wanted to get baptized, I was looking for a name that morning before I go to church. I looked at the Bible. I wanted to call myself Genesis and all that strange things. I didn't know what to do. Then I saw Yes, on Numbers, on Leviticus. My dad said, are you crazy? I'm like, I don't know what name to use. Then I saw on a small Bible, a red pen where they wrote Simon. I'm like, okay, I use this one. Then I ran to the church and the priest was asking me, what's the name for baptism? I forgot. He was looking at me, I was like, oh. Then he left me, then I shouted, Simon, 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 Simon. Then he came back and baptized me, Simon. Then I entered religious life. The congregation has had a ritual of choosing a name in religion when you enter the novitiate, like a form of new baptism. So I didn't want to give up Simon, so I added Mary, not the pious Mary you have made Mary to be, but the badass Mary. That was the one I chose. The one who smacked her son for talking dirt nonsense to her. The one who made her son to perform the first miracle. I was like, there's something about this Mary I like. Rebellious. Okay. So I added Mary to Simon. So when I left religious life, all my documents still bore Simon Mary. I was like, who cares? I'll just leave it. I'll keep it. Does that help? Good. Ladies now? Then I'll talk to you, then you. Yeah, go ahead.
So, and you probably answered it a little bit, but when it comes to the question of the language of the colonizers. What's your name? Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Tina from Chicago. When it comes to the language of the colonizers, how do we use that language of the colonizer to bring forth a new language of hope and renewal and spirituality?
Good question. This debate has been had between Chinua Achebe and Ngugi wa Thiong'o in the 60s or 70s. They had the debate. Achebe said, we can still use English to speak, but we use it in a sly way. And that was what the plantation, and then Wa Thiong'o says, no, that there is something coded in the language that will always split your imagination. I'm done. So since 1986, he started writing in Kikuyu. The last book he wrote in English was The Decolonizing the Mind, the African Mind, and so. But there's another Nigerian author, Tutu Ola, who does a fun play with language and shows how Achebe was doing it. That you use English and Creole or Ebonics together. So there's a certain extent, one group understands, the master, the owner of that language understands the discourse, then they are thrown off, they no longer know what is going on anymore. So, and I think, and I tend to like that as a pedagogical approach. In my classroom, I use that as a tool that the classroom, the teacher cannot have all the linguistic or linguistic power all the time, or else it becomes a dynamics of control. But they must lose control so that the students gain the control and they can learn, and then the students teach them. That happened in the plantation churches as well. And what are the plantation churches? The plantation churches, they gather. Black religious experience and spirituality is that is at the heart of it. There are the slave owners looking at them, oh yes, they must be. They are following what we told them, they are being good Christians. But it's the Christianity of rebellion. Coded with everything you can imagine. That's what the spirituals are. Yeah, so that's it.
So very much like code switching.
Yes! Yes, religious code switching, we do it. Do it well.
Yes.
Hi everyone, I'm Vicki from Detroit, and it actually, it mirrors her question a little bit, but you talked about how colonizers colonize us versus Christianize us. And I was just going to ask, what were some things that we did to keep from accepting all that colonization, because there's still some resistance among us. You see it in the Great Migration, where we have the guts to get up and leave, and you see it in civil rights, we see it in other ways where our struggle led us from becoming 100% colonized. I mean, that imagination has still been limited, but it hasn't been squashed. What were some of the tools that we as Black people use not to become completely consumed?
Good question. Good question. I'm going to give you a simple answer.
Okay.
Sorry, not simple, but I'm going to help you. Now, pretend that this classroom is, this room is filled with people and all seats are taken. I call it the hermeneutic of generosity. That in our heads, in our theologies, in our ritual spaces, in how we pray and so on and so forth, we must ask ourselves, is there an empty chair in that space? The empty chair is not only for the stranger, it's the chair of question. Who are we erasing from our struggle? Or else we will become empires and stooges of empire and create new empires of erasure again. That's why I said it's not about hate. You can be angry, but you must not hate. It's righteous indignation. But in that righteous indignation, this empty chair is what prevents you from slipping to the other extreme. It happened in Africa. We wanted Europeans out of the continent, but we had no hermeneutic of generosity in our imagination of a post-colonial Africa. And we moved from this swing to this swing, and we became oppressors to ourselves. Blackness does not mean everyone is happy, kumbaya, kumbaya. We kill each other. We are capable of destroying each other. Look at Chicago. Black on black crimes. Black institutions destroy each other. But we forget. That is why MLK was quite a strange creature. Because he knew the power of evil. If we say all white people are bad, no, not all white people are bad, are you kidding me? We need white solidarity in our struggle. Not all black people are innocent. Who sold MLK to his brains to be shot out? Was a black person who betrayed him. Steve Biko of South Africa and so on. So we must understand that evil is real, and we are all capable of evil. And hermeneutic of generosity is how we are always conscious of that. If I always ask the question, who is not in this room? Why are they not in this room? What are the structures in place that make the people not to get to this room? What can we do to make sure they get here? That's what you need to do. If you stop asking that question, then you know that you have created an idol of empire. That's how you know. When you become too comfortable in that chair, and too comfortable eating that food, there's a problem. Next time. No, go ahead. Then I'll come to you.
Thank you. I think that's kind of maybe the perfect setup.
Your name?
I'm Leonard Curry. I'm a new professor in the Department of Theology, so at least one of us is here. Two of us are here. That was you running. So,
dear colleague.
The question that I had was just about the kind of crises that Blackness is going through. So there's the kind of Fanonian account and like Blackness as pathological via the white gaze. But then the crisis that is what you were just talking about, it was just kind of a moral crisis that's at maybe the center of Blackness. And I think maybe you talked about it in your talk in terms of Blackness needing its own kind of kenosis, etc. And I guess I'm just wondering if we're using the Christic model, right? Jesus goes into the tomb, Christ comes out. Do we know that Blackness comes out on the other side?
Good question. I'll continue. Finish your thought.
Yeah, no, that's it. Like, if we're in this crisis and it's both moral, political, social, psychic, imaginative, in terms of the imagination, we might go in, but we don't know what will come out. So yeah, so what?
Good question. Good question. Let me first of all say that the language, we need to be careful about the language crisis and all that stuff. We're already instantiating empire pathology again, which I understand is not what you are doing. What if it's a moment of grace? The black world is going through right now. Because every crisis is a moment of grace. Permit me to use Latin. I love Latin to death. Ubi peccata, ibi gratia maior. Where the greater the evil, the more present is God's grace. The darker the night, the more present is light. This is not a crisis. It is a moment of grace. It is a gift we are giving so that we, the prophets, can help us to imagine. The black community is in crisis because we no longer have enough prophets who can help us to tap into memories of life. And when you do not have prophets that tap into memories of life, then you no longer see. Everything becomes a problem. Now, that said, the journey is not about I feel good, la 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 la, that song came to my head just now. It's not about that. It's not about quantifying what has happened. It's about the journey. The mount, let me use a biblical context. The journey, the two disciples on their journey from Jerusalem to Emmaus. It wasn't a moment they realized who Jesus was. It was in the encounter that was a movement. They were walking with Jesus. And Jesus was unfolding this. Ignorance is not addressed in a moment. It is a process. So, it is not for you and I to say, have we come out from the pit of crisis? No. Our job is not, that's not our job. Our job is to keep doing the work. Let the fruits of our labor be inherited by the next generation. Because MLK, the fruits of MLK, you and I are celebrating today. Or else, you will not even be in academia. I teach in a predominantly white institution. I'm the first tenured black professor in the university's history after 120 years. It will never have happened. So MLK achieved something in the Pacific Northwest. Though he was not there. But his dream extended there. That's what we need to do. Keep doing the work. And then let God allow the fruits to be planted. It will grow. Somebody has there. Two more, and then we end it. Yeah. Oh, Zita, yeah.
I can wait.
No, you. Go ahead, Zita.
You talked about, after this young theologian spoke, my name is Zita, I'm sorry. I'm a student in the Institute of Black Catholic Studies. I'm real tired. My question to you is the imagination for room as we create the love communities with the African diaspora and the African American diaspora. And just to mention, African American language used in the story of The Color Purple has a name, and I was lacking because I don't get no sleep around here. So I wanted to add it to his verbose list of the other languages used. So if you get a minute, think about it, because it's a V, and I can't remember what it stands for. But my question is, what are some of the things other than walking, encountering, and I don't think you've given enough attention to what a real encounter is for people to understand, because that is really what provides the juice to move through the time span that's not ours. So I'm concerned in my American way, be it African American or somewhat subsistive still in the whiteness, coming up with creative ways to push that juice. And I ask you this because of your history as a priest.
No, I'm not a priest.
But your history as a priest, being a man who's a priest, and encountering institutions. Just give me a minute. Encountering institution and having to deal with continued movement in the other spectrum without blackness. Because for us, that's a real struggle.
Okay. Encounter is, I thought I'm not a priest. Let's get that right. I was religious, I was never ordained. Maybe priesthood, royal priesthood, yes, put the crown on my head. I am baptized, so I'm a royal priest. No, encounter is about embodying vulnerability. It's about openness. That's why I talk about there can be no encounter unless there is kenosis, an emptying. It's always about surprise. It's about the deconstruction of your own meta framework of being naked. And it does not happen, it's not understood in a chronos time. It's always about the kairos moment of God. It can take many years.
Yes.
It can take a moment. And it's not you or I who bring it about. All you just need to do is tell the Spirit, allow me to be ready for this gift you want to give. So everyone you meet, it can be a possibility of an encounter. But once you open yourself to that, it opens to you, you will know. Your hermeneutic framework will change. You can go to classrooms. I have many class professors who taught me my life. If you ask me now what I learned, there are very few things. And they were not the ones I thought I would have ever learned anything from. I teach African religions, but the person who taught me, I got a D. Because I thought he was a crazy teacher. I didn't know what he was talking about. I zoned out. But there were just few things he taught that never left me, that pushed me to that discipline to go, and now I'm teaching it. So those of you who are teachers, educators, know this. You can teach an entire semester, and you ask the students, what did you learn? They just tell you 5 minutes. And that's the encounter. Every other thing was footnote. So that is it. It is not about descriptive. You can't even describe it. You can only talk about the experience, what it has done to you. This lecture I've just given might not mean anything to any of you, or it might mean something to some of you, but you will be shocked that what it means to you is not even what I intended. Never. That's what Martin Buber talks about, I am thou. The gift that comes from the thou is never controlled by the I. I have given you a lecture. That's the I. But what you receive is only God who knows how God wants you to receive it, or maybe not receive it at all. But if I get angry, I say, oh no, you must receive it, then there is a problem. That's no longer an I-thou relationship, it's an I-it relationship. Does that make sense? Yeah. And it does not happen within the world of power. It's outside of the matrix of power. One last question. And, oh yes, the lady.
Hi everyone. So my name is Materi Nan. I'm a Liberian woman, Louisiana lifelong resident, and a degree student here. So my first introduction to theology was actually as a senior in college. Similarly to you, I took a random class that was about Jesus Christ, and I discovered Black liberation theology and got very excited by it. And so when you mentioned James Cone, the cross and the lynching tree is what sort of stuck out to me. And so I always think about the words to me that are most impactful in the book, where he says, every time that a white mob lynched an innocent Black man, they were actually lynching Jesus, and they didn't know about it. So I guess I just want to ask, how do you see, since you mentioned James Cone in your lecture, how do you see that connecting with just what you talked about earlier, and if there is a struggle within, I sometimes find that there is a struggle identifying with white people who want to do the work of liberation, who are excited and interesting, but I'm still very hurt by the history and sometimes modern day, racial injustice that we face. So I guess I just want to ask, how do you reconcile that, or what would you say from your lecture helps us to bring all of that together?
Good question. Let me also ask you a question. Do you think it is easy for a white person to enter into the spaces where Black bodies are and say, hey, I want to be an ally? Yes, they might come in from the place of privilege, but in that space, there is an existential discomfort. Let me give you another instance. George Floyd was killed 9 minutes, 46 seconds. Everyone was angry. Oh, Derek, what is his name? The officer, Sheldon. He's a devil, he needs to be killed, blah, 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 blah. So I gave a talk at Niagara University where I said, no, the first person who was dehumanized by racism was not George Floyd, it was that officer. The humanity left him. And that, it was because he was no longer fully human that he could have done that type of thing. And so the only way, if we really want to embody the Christ-like radical love, not the I feel good type of love we are talking about, the real love that Christ talks about, 2 hands must be stretched out at the same time, that lifts the body of George Floyd's and the officer's body and say, come, both of you, need to experience the true humanity of Christ. At that stage, it's okay to feel angry. Emotions are okay. They are not evil. There are ways God speaks to us, our emotions. After all, Jesus Christ beat the crap out of the people in the temple. Emotions are okay. It's okay to be angry, but don't let anger steal your joy and your hope. It's okay to be angry. Be pissed off. They did this to our people. But after a while, you're like, you know what, I'm tired of talking now. Where's my brother, my sister? Come, let's go do this work. Because we need a better world that is larger than you and me. That is what Christ meant, love one another. Christian love is very difficult. It is for the strong, not for the weak. And if you embody the Christian love, you are one of the strong. Thank you.
Thank you.
See all the people in the back that came in. What a great turnout. Thank y'all so much for coming to challenge and to hear what our brother has to say, and for him to challenge and to stretch us, as I think he did today. But I want to thank those who, this is your first time on Xavier's campus. Anybody here, this is your first time visiting? No? But then, oh, thank you. We have people here, we have an administrator of the university, Ms. Carrie Alexander, who is with us. She's with VP for Student Services. So Xavier is represented here. Thank you so much for being with us. Absolutely. We have friends of the Institute who are here. We thank you for being here. Back over there.
Fumi.
Our friends of the Institute, thank you so much always for supporting us.
Edith.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's she right there. In the white. Fumi. Hey, my sister.
We have students, our students who didn't have to come, but you all came because y'all were intrigued by what more this man could say. And so we thank our students who made time in the day to come and to be with us today to hear what Dr. Iyer had.
I'll give you an A. It's okay.
I'll practice some more. And we have our faculty and staff who are here. So thank you very much. And I know we have some brothers here who were invited by Dr. O'Day. We thank you for being with us, for coming. Those of you, some of you have come and said mass for us, and we thank you. We've got to build this relationship. And so come and join us any time. Come and join us. Because we have to do the work that Zita said. We have to build that community African to save our communities and to save our church. And to save our church. So thank you all again for coming. And